Hello, this is Archie Dunlop with Talking Astrology with Archie on Friday, July the 14th, 2023. Happy Bastille Day! The Bastille was that fortress in Paris, France, which was stormed on July the 14th, 1789. And that day represents the beginning of modern France. So arguably we can take the chart for the storming of the Bastille and treat that as a chart of France. Now, I know there are other charts to use, for example, the Fifth Republic, but I don't know. I think that date, July the 14th, has such amazing significance that I think that chart is the one to go for. So that is one of the things I will be doing today. I will be looking at the Bastille Day, chart, or rather the chart for the storming of the Bastille. I will also be looking at the horoscope of the Bastille's most famous inmate. I mean, he was actually released, I believe, shortly before the storming of the Bastille. I think he was transferred to a lunatic asylum some days before, but he did spend some time in the Bastille, so I will be looking at that. And there's also the issue of the Sun newspaper and the fact that the BBC presenter, who all these allegations had been made about, his identity has been revealed. So let me just show you what I'm talking about. Here is the Sun newspaper, and the headline is Beeb Crisis, Huw Edwards named as BBC presenter in sex pictures scandal by wife in emotional statement and reveals he's in hospital. News anchor Huw Edwards was last night named by his own wife as the presenter at the centre of the BBC scandal, as the corporation revealed fresh allegations against him. Vicky Flyne made a shock statement announcing her husband was receiving treatment in hospital for serious mental health issues. So moments later, the BBC revealed that Mr. Edwards, 61, faced more allegations of inappropriate behaviour, this time towards his junior TV colleagues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to also look at Huw Edwards' horoscope. I don't think we have his time of birth. We only have his date of birth. So that's what I'll be looking at. I don't think I'll spend very long on it. I've looked at his horoscope already. It's not a chart that really appeals to me. I mean, says much to me. But so I'll see if we can find out anything about it. But before I look at these charts, look at Huw Edwards, Bastille Day, the inmate of the Bastille, who's of course the Marquis de Sade, I want to look at what's happening in the stars today. And today is, of course, July the 14th, 2023. So let's have a look. So this is the chart I drew up for Friday, July the 14th, 2023, for noon. I set it for New York. So we can see that the moon is still in Gemini. The moon isn't actually doing a great deal in Gemini. It's sort of moving towards a sextile of Venus in Leo, but not. It's quite a way off. So yeah, there's still going to be more communication than usual. After all, the moon is in Gemini. It will be like words will come easy to us, easier than usual. When we're feeling under pressure, even emotional pressure, the easiest thing to do might be to just talk. You know how it is. You just keep talking and hope that the issue goes away. Now, that's not the only thing happening today. There is a rather difficult aspect between Mercury and Saturn. You can see that Mercury is at 641 Leo and Saturn is at 638 Pisces. So that means that the Mercury and Saturn are 150 degrees apart. In other words, they're forming a quincunx aspect. So when you have a quincunx, there's an unease there. You know, Mercury in Leo, you want to communicate, lots of things you want to talk about, and you want to kind of maybe sing your own praises. Who doesn't? But then it's quincunx Saturn. Saturn is holding us back. You know, there may be authority figures, people we are perhaps slightly afraid of. You know, we feel we don't really want to express ourselves. I mean, we'd like to express ourselves, but we're afraid to. And so we have to work out how to deal with this. You know, if we're going to communicate, we have to accept the limitations around us and find the right way of getting these words out into the open. Also, there is some ongoing stuff going on. You know, the last few days, I've talked about Venus being on the Mars-Uranus midpoint. And so it's still on the Mars-Uranus midpoint. Now, you might be asking, why is Venus still on the Mars-Uranus midpoint when it is supposed to be a fast-moving planet? The reason being is that Venus is now slowing down in a big way. You know, normally Venus goes, you know, goes over a degree a day on average, but now it's going slower and slower and slower because it's about to go retrograde. So that means that when Venus crosses a midpoint, it's going to stay there longer. Hence, Venus is still on the Mars-Uranus midpoint at a time when Hades, the hypothetical planet Hades, is on the Mars-Uranus midpoint. So the kind of warnings I've given over the last couple of days, they still stand. You know, we have to be careful what we do, particularly in terms of money and relationships. Venus is the universal planet of relationships. When it's on the Mars-Uranus midpoint, relationships could get quite explosive very quickly. Things might break. That's Mars and Uranus, and of course explosions is about Mars and Uranus. And then you throw in Hades, and as I've said before, Venus could be acting as a trigger. So Hades is on the Mars-Uranus midpoint. That is about explosive and dangerous events, and so Venus is still there. So it kind of has the capacity to cause a lot of damage. Now, there is another aspect today, and it's probably the most important aspect today, and it is Sun sesquiquadrate Saturn. You see, Sun is at 658 Cancer, Saturn is at 638 Pisces, and that means that those two planets are 135 degrees apart. That is 3/8 of the circle. So, the Sun is how we try to express ourselves. We express our identity through the Sun. I think particularly for males. I think for females, maybe the Moon is going to be more important. But then Saturn, Sun sesquiquadrate Saturn, there are things holding us back. It's rather like what I said with Mercury quincunx Saturn. There are things holding us back. And both the Sun and Saturn are on the Pluto-Kronos midpoint. Now, Kronos is a hypothetical planet connected with the government. Pluto is about transformation. And at the most extreme, Sun and Saturn on the Pluto-Kronos midpoint may be about the overthrow of governments. Very appropriate for Bastille Day. Or it might be the overthrow of authority figures. So anyone who is in government, who is an authority figure, they may be more vulnerable than usual. particularly with that Saturn on, on the, Saturn on the Pluto-Kronos midpoint and Sun kind of triggering it. So that is something to consider. And there's another hypothetical planet that's beginning to hit the Pluto-Kronos midpoint, and that is Zeus. Zeus is a hypothetical planet that often connected with warfare and weaponry, and it can, I think Vita suggests that Zeus on the Pluto-Kronos midpoint can mean a sudden change in warfare. He was interested in war because he started to develop his system of hypothetical planets during the First World Wars, and he was writing in immediate aftermath of the First World War. So warfare and its consequences was something that was very important to him, something he couldn't ignore in post First World War Germany. So a sudden turn, a sudden change, perhaps that relates to the war in Ukraine. Will it affect us? Well, we've all, or at least many of us, have to deal with authority figures, and so those authority figures that are making our lives miserable, perhaps, maybe they're not as powerful as we think, and maybe things are changing. So that is something to consider. Now, I'm going to turn to my forecasts for the 12 signs for today. And, I would remind you that I've created chapters, where I've given the timestamps for each of these 12 signs, so you don't have to necessarily listen to all the 12 signs as I go through them. You can, pick out your sign and then move on. I still haven't worked out a way around it, but it's a lot for me to ask of you to listen to my forecast for each of the 12 signs. But anyway, here goes. Aries, a quieter day when you can limit your activities to things that you feel comfortable with. There is nothing that has to be done, and your communications can take place at a distance. And those close to you are slowing down, and at the same time, they might need some guidance and reassurance. You can be a great therapist when you want to be. Taurus, there is something still bothering you, and your reactions to everyday situations might be hasty and unwise. After all, Venus, your ruler, continues to aspect the rather dangerous Mars-Uranus midpoint. But in terms of money, there may be a moment of quiet where you can reconsider your overall strategy. Gemini, Mercury, your ruler, is making an 150-degree aspect to Saturn. You might feel that circumstances are cramping your style, but really you're being told to make a change. It's not a time to be stubborn, and your clever arguments are unlikely to work. But hey, you're a Gemini. Your flexibility is your trump card. Cancer, in some respects, it's a heavy day, but is it your problem? You can watch other people spin their wheels, but I don't think you'll be directly involved in the drama. Of course, if you make the choice to spend time with friends and colleagues and to share what's going on in their lives, it might be a different story. Leo, the Sun is making a stressful 135-degree aspect to Saturn. As a result, you may feel that it is difficult to express yourself and that there are powerful forces holding you back. It's a temporary situation, and in the meantime, you shouldn't feel that you have to take on the world all by yourself. Virgo, if you're working, then I don't think that much is going to happen. But if you're trying to achieve big things, you might be disappointed. Circumstances may conspire to hold you up, and you may be disappointed by the actions and reactions of partners and people who you work closely with. Libra, you're able to broaden your horizons, at least on a mental and intellectual level. But when it comes to making the actual moves, it could be hard work, and things could quickly go wrong. Perhaps your ambitious journeys should be in spirit rather than in the flesh, at least in the short term. Scorpio, you may feel that people aren't listening to you, particularly younger people. It's not that they're being disrespectful, rather your message needs to be adjusted. And that means listening to your feelings and hunches and not being too logical about the situation. And consider the possibility that not everyone can function at your pace. Sagittarius, it's difficult to apply yourself. You are not in full control of your environment, and it seems that everything requires someone else's permission. Yet it also seems that no one is in a particularly good situation. So perhaps you just have to blend into the background and not do anything to attract attention. Capricorn, you're able to hold things up. So if you don't like the way things are going, you can probably do something about it. However, you need a good reason to be a troublemaker, and pride shouldn't be one of them. You need to base your arguments on logic and have the evidence to support your position. Aquarius, the Sun is making a stressful aspect to Saturn, and as a result, you may feel estranged from the world. Perhaps it feels that you're too much to deal with, but it's only a passing phase, and you now have a chance to explore your own fundamental abilities. In general, though, you must make an effort to be approachable. And Pisces, you have likes and dislikes, and you need to be honest about it. Not everyone is on your wavelength, and you shouldn't try too hard to be pleasant and tolerant. You're also aware that the world isn't getting any better, and it might soon be time to take evasive action. It's not anything personal. It's about the way society is moving. I'm now going to switch to the I Ching. As usual, I threw 3 coins in the air. I asked the question, what is Friday going to be like for visitors to my YouTube channel? So, the first hexagram I got was obstruction. That means that the path is blocked. So whatever we're trying to do today, particularly at the beginning of the day, we're going to be blocked. It's just not going to be possible to get where we want to get to. So the question is, how do we deal with the situation? So the I Ching has 2 moving lines, the top line and the bottom line. So the bottom line is about sort of early action, perhaps what's going on this morning or the beginning of the day. And it's really saying that, if we've got a block, if we can't sort something out, we shouldn't just keep trying. It's just a waste of time. The honourable thing and the best thing to do is to retreat and reconsider the situation. So spend some time working out how to deal with the obstruction. Then the top line moves, and that means that we have to have another go at it. And the I Ching has very different advice for the second time we have a go at it. And for the second time, it's really saying we do need to give it a go. We have an obligation to try our hardest to remove this obstacle, of course, provided we're not putting ourselves in any risk, physical, mental, whatever risk. Obviously, we can't do that, but provided there's not that kind of risk around, we have to do our best to remove this obstacle, to solve a particular problem. It's not going to be easy, no guarantees of success, but we kind of have some moral obligation to do it. And then the hexagram changes to hexagram 37, which is the family. So towards the end of the day, we can stop worrying so much about dealing with this particular issue, and maybe we will deal with it, and then we can start focusing on the people close to us. That could be family, close friends, for at work, colleagues who we're close to, who we want to protect. And so that's how it ends. And maybe this puts the whole thing into this whole thing about obstruction into context. There is a problem that is not just affecting us, but the people close to us, family, friends, etc. And it's our obligation to try to deal with the problem. And it's kind of suggesting that actually we can deal with the problem. And in so doing, we can bring everyone together. So now I'm going to look at some charts. And the first chart I want to look at is the chart of the storming of the Bastille. And from what I can see, the key time on July the 14th, 1789 was 1:30 p.m. Now, the great thing about France is when you look at all these charts, they've got times, Marquis de Sade, we've got a time for the Marquis de Sade. So that's really good. It makes it very easy. In Britain, for example, they can be completely terrible about times. But so this is a chart for the storming of the Bastille. So the beginning of the French Revolution, the symbolic beginning of France. So what do we notice in this chart? Well, Moon is in Aries. I suppose if you're trying to start a revolution, having a Moon in Aries, that sort of action-orientated placement is great. The Moon in astrology is the people, the mob even. So the Moon in Aries, the mob, they want action. And the sixth house. Note how the Moon is in the sixth house. In astrology, the sixth house is often connected with servants, laborers, people often at the bottom of society, in a sort of pre-revolution peasant society. That's not saying the sixth house is in itself bad. It's just these people who are sort of rising up. So the Moon is in the sixth house. It's just separating from a trine to Jupiter. So that is that's pretty appropriate. And the Sun is in Cancer. Like America, the United States, born on July the 4th. So in what way is modern France a Cancerian country? I think that it's a Cancerian country in the sense that traditionally it's quite focused on itself. The nation is very important to the French. Its past is very important to the French. For example, the French have really tried to hang on to their colonies, far more than the British. Indeed, there are places all over the world that are now part of France, literally part of France, not colonies. They're treated. There's this little island off Canada. There are these places in the Indian Ocean. There's New Caledonia. And New Caledonia is really big. So France has done its best to hold on. There's that place in in South America. It's quite a big place, you know. So it's the French have tried to, as far as possible, hang on to the past, hang on to their colonies. So that's Cancer, you know, not wanting to let go of its children, not wanting to let go of its past. And although that seems to have nothing to do with the storming of the Bastille, that seems to have become a feature of France. Maybe because the sun was in Cancer when the Bastille was stormed. We have, you know, Venus-Uranus conjunction. That is exciting. It may, I suppose, it may say something about the image of France. I mean, I suppose the French image about, you know, sort of the style and you know, the French sort of sex symbols and Marianne. So Marianne, I think Marianne is like some universal French female personification of the country. I mean, I don't really know a great deal about France, but I think maybe that Venus-Uranus, even Venus conjunct Jupiter, Venus on the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint, says something perhaps about that. So the question is, can we really trust this chart? I mean, shouldn't we try to put this chart to the test? So by taking a date in French history post Bastille, the storming of the Bastille, and ask, does it fit? So off the top of my head, the worst day in French history post 1789 would be June the 22nd, 1940. That is the date that France surrendered to the Germans. It was obviously a day of national humiliation, and the French still haven't got over it. So if a Bastille chart works, you'd expect there to be a strong connection between it and the chart for the surrender. Now here is the surrender chart, the armistice. You know, this was, you know, in 1940, Germans invaded France, overwhelmed them, French surrendered, and this is it. June the 22nd, 1940, I think it was at 6:36 p.m. So here's the chart. The chart in itself, I suppose, you know, sort of a angular Uranus on the 7th house cusp. So maybe that's sort of quite telling. We've got stuff in Cancer. Does this stuff in Cancer tie with the stuff in Cancer in the Bastille chart? So let's just do a bi-wheel. Inside is a Bastille Day chart. Outside is the chart for the surrender on June the 22nd, 1940. So there is Mars. The surrender Mars in 1940 was at 23 Cancer. So we can see that 23 Cancer is pretty close to Sun in Cancer, part of Fortune in Cancer, and Mercury in Cancer in the Bastille Day chart. So I suppose that kind of fits. Surrender, Mars, the enemy, conjuncture Sun. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of seems okay. Then anything else? Well, Jupiter's in the 7th house, Saturn is in the 7th house. I mean, it's not exactly on the cusp, but I suppose you could say Saturn in the 7th house represents, you know, the enemy. So, I mean, it's okay. I mean, I wouldn't have said it was an absolutely brilliant tie-up. So let's look at just something else and look at the solar return for so here's a Bastille Day, so the Bastille chart. So and the Sun is at 22 Cancer. So we can take the solar return, the moment the Sun returns to where it was at the time of the storming of the Bastille, immediately prior to the surrender. So that that solar return would be in 19. That would be the solar return for. So this is it. I mean, sorry, this is the solar return, July the 15th, 1939. So this is the solar return prior to the surrender. The Bastille, so that's when the sun returned to where it was on July the 14th, 1789, and when it returned in 1939. So you often look at solar returns to work out what's going to happen in the following year. So let's take this solar return set for July the 15th, 1939, and see how it fits with the surrender chart. So let's have a look at those two charts. Sorry, I'm going to be looking at how the solar return fits, not the surrender chart, how the solar return hits the natal chart. So that means that I'm going to be putting the inner wheel is going to be the Bastille, outer wheel is going to be the solar return. So you got that, you've got inner wheel, we've got the 1789 storming of the Bastille. Outer wheel, we've got the chart for July the 15th, 1939, the solar return immediately preceding the surrender. And we can see that Saturn in the solar return was exactly on the 7th house cusp of the 1789 chart. You can see Saturn was at 0 Taurus, and compared to 2 Taurus for the Bastille, for 1789. So that kind of fits. Saturn in the 7th, yeah, that suggests surrender. The enemy is getting the better of you. When you look at Mars in this solar return was square the descendant, and Pluto at 0 degrees Leo was also square the ascendant. So at the time of this solar return, there was a T-square. So Pluto was opposition Mars, and Saturn was on the T, and this whole configuration was hitting the 1789 descendant. So I think that's enough evidence to suggest that the chart of the storming of the Bastille is valid, that we should be looking at it for a chart for France. And I want to make one other point about the Bastille chart. We've been hearing a lot about America's Pluto return. That's when Pluto returns to where it was on July the 4th, 1789. And July the 4th, 1776. So the United States is having its Pluto return at the moment, and it's a time of great transformation, drama, when the fundamentals of the whole country might be under threat. England has had several Pluto returns. One of its Pluto returns took place at a time of massive religious animosity. It was actually in the reign of Mary the First, when there was a counter-reformation, when Protestants were being burnt at the stake. So that was how Britain experienced one of its solar returns. It had one of its Pluto returns. England had another Pluto return in, I think, 1801, when I think the Parliament of Ireland got dissolved and all the Parliament got centralised. So the whole structure of government between the nations in the British Isles got changed in 1801. So in Britain, Pluto return has certainly worked well. United States, it seems perhaps to be working well. And France has got its Pluto at 18 Aquarius. Now, Pluto is about to go into Aquarius very soon. So in around 2034, 2035, France will have a Pluto return. It will have its first Pluto return. Maybe it'll be its last Pluto return. France has got some major tensions going on, like pretty much every European country, but in France it seems to be particularly serious. So the question one has to ask, is France going to be able to survive its Pluto return, which is in about not much more than 10 years' time, which in astrological terms is nothing. So yes, that is something we need to consider. Now, I did promise that I would look at the chart of the Marquis de Sade. Now, if you don't know, the word sadist comes from the Marquis de Sade. It's spelled S-A-D-E. And so he has this reputation of being sadistic. I think there have even been horror films about him. Did I see a horror film once about the Marquis de Sade's skull? But I don't actually think he was a particularly scary person in reality. I mean, he caused a lot of scandal through his writings. I mean, he wrote, what was it, 120 Days of Sodom, and they were obviously on a sexual theme. Various supposed sexual perversions and whatever, but it was all words. Although you can understand that in 18th century France, people might have been quite scandalized by what he was doing, and might have decided to declare him insane or whatever. But I think we can see the fact that it was really just words. In fact, that he's a Gemini. I mean, who else but a Gemini would enjoy scandalizing society by writing books about sexual perversion? And I should say I've never read anything by him. I'm sure it's difficult to read, and certainly wouldn't be able to do it in the original French. So I think that fits with his sun in Gemini. So we also notice, and I think this is probably the engine of why he did what he did, why he wrote what he did, that he has a Venus-Saturn conjunction in Cancer, which is square Mars. So in other words, he has Mars square his Venus-Saturn midpoint. Now, Venus-Saturn, surprisingly, there's often a connection in terms of Venus-Saturn, with sexual immorality. Now, that might sound weird, but it's often the case. Often a connection of prostitution and Venus-Saturn. I think the logic would be that the Venus principle, which is about relating, is distorted by Saturn. Saturn can be about money, materialism, just focusing on physical details. Saturn can wreck the normal expression of Venus. And so then Mars on the Venus-Saturn midpoint, you can see Mars in Aries on the Venus-Saturn midpoint. That's how the Marquis de Sade wants to express himself, and so it hits a Venus-Saturn midpoint. As far as the writing is concerned, I mean, he was a really talented person. He wasn't just a writer, and he was involved in politics. He wasn't guillotined. I mean, you'd expect that someone like the Marquis de Sade, during the Terror, being a nobleman, would have been beheaded, or if he was in Paris or whatever. No, he managed to survive a revolution, and I think he died in 1814 at the age of 74, which is a good age. For someone to survive all of that, to survive a revolution and the Terror, and to be a nobleman, and I don't know, he must have been quite an amazing person. But look at his moon. His moon is in Virgo, and he's got Mercury in Taurus. So the moon is applying to a trine of Mercury. And you'll notice that Mercury is in the exaltation of Taurus, sorry, in the exaltation of the moon, and the moon is in the exaltation of Mercury. So the moon and Mercury are in mutual reception, and they're applying to a trine. And that would explain why he was such a good writer. I mean, I assume he's a good writer. I haven't read any of his stuff, but he has clearly been very influential, not least because sadism is named after him. Oh, there's one other thing, just a trivial point about his chart. So that this conjunction between Venus Saturn in Cancer, it kind of reminds me of something else. And there's someone else who's actually got a conjunction of Venus Saturn in Cancer. You can read into it what you like. Yeah, that's it. Donald Trump. There's Donald Trump. He's got a Venus Saturn in Cancer, a closer Venus Saturn conjunction than the Marquis de Sade, but it is there. So maybe that's my challenge to you. Work out how is Donald Trump like the Marquis de Sade? How do they both experience this Venus Saturn conjunction in Cancer? Now, finally, I want to talk about Huw Edwards, the BBC presenter. You know, as I said, I don't find his chart very interesting. So he was born on August the 18th, 1961, in Bridgend, Wales, and I don't have a time of birth, so I've gone for noon. So the question is, what do we notice? Okay, he's got the moon in Scorpio. We don't know precisely where in Scorpio, but I suppose the moon in Scorpio has a certain reputation for keeping things hidden, for being secretive, for having perhaps a side to his life that the rest of the world can't see, doesn't see. And then that moon in Scorpio is conjunct Neptune, so there's the sort of mists of confusion which is hiding it all from us. So I would guess that whatever's happened has got a lot to do with the Moon Neptune conjunction in Scorpio. He also has a Sun Uranus conjunction in Leo, but I don't know. Yes, Sun in Uranus doing something surprising, but I would have thought that Sun conjunct Uranus in Leo is more overt and more obvious. It's close to Mercury as well. You see, he's got Mercury on Regulus. Regulus is the royal star, and having Mercury on Regulus, and he's a TV presenter, and I think involved with royal events. Regulus, royal star. So if you've got stuff close to Regulus, it can often mean that you have connections with important people, including royalty, and so maybe that's how he was able to use his Mercury in Regulus, his Mercury conjunct Regulus. It is quincunx Jupiter, so perhaps his challenge was always how to express that Mercury. But I don't find his chart terribly informative about what he is experiencing. Lots of people have Moon Neptune conjunction in Scorpio. In itself, it's not a big deal. I did look at his solar return, though. His solar return. So if you took a solar return, you'd go for. If that's his solar return for. He's born in August, so you'd actually look at his solar return for last year. So you look at August 2022. So let's have a quick look at his solar return, see if that tells us anything interesting. So this is his solar return. So what's interesting about this return chart is the fact that he's got Sun. The Sun is the important planet. I know it's not a planet, it's a star, but in astrology we call it a planet. Sun is opposition Saturn, so there might be some kind of sort of restriction, something getting him down last year. This would have been also shown by the fact that a year ago he was having a transiting Saturn opposition his Sun, and of course it showed up in his solar return. And this Sun-Saturn opposition is connected with Mars. You see, he's got Uranus square Saturn. He's got Mars square the Sun. So he does have this T-square in his solar return. And this may have had something to do with it. So the solar return, yeah, it certainly indicated that something might have been going on. And, it reminds us that when we're doing people's charts, always look at the solar return. Solar return, yeah, they can be a bit hit and miss, but if there's something big going on, very often they will show up in the solar return. And this solar return did have this T-square involving some rather difficult planets. And, we can see that there is Mars, Sun is kind of on the Mars-Saturn midpoint there. So if you've got Sun on the Mars-Saturn midpoint in the solar return, that Mars-Saturn midpoint can be very destructive, can be very frustrating, can really bring things to a halt. So yeah, I think the solar return perhaps explains the timing of what happened, but I'm not fully satisfied with it. I looked at other stuff. I didn't really find anything particularly amazing. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say on the subject, and I am going to wrap it up here. So I will talk to you again tomorrow.